During last week's adventure, Gheeotine found himself getting depressed at ranting at the physical state of media, so his hopeful assistant Charles threw him a game to talk about to cheer up. This week, let's join him as he talks about that game.
Hey everyone, my name's Guillotine, and I'm here to tell you today that I like Star Fox. As far as Nintendo franchises go, I regard it with more admiration than most of the other major thoroughbreds in Miyamoto's stable like Mario and Zelda, with only Pokémon being comparable in my mind. That being said, just as with any of their other franchises, not all the games are created equal. So today on this Gaming Guillotine Order of Execution, I'm going to go over all the games in Nintendo's anthropomorphic starfaring franchise and rank them for your pleasure and mental compartmentalization. To be included on this list, there are two rules. A Star Fox game has to have Fox McCloud or a playable member of Star Fox team, and B, you have to have third-person ship combat, so nothing by means of Super Smash Bros. Or anything like that. Now, before I begin in earnest, it should be made aware that I'm basing this list off my own opinions. If you disagree, then feel free to voice your disagreement below. So with that out of the way, let's begin with... Number 10. For those who have seen some of my previous works, you'll know that StarFox Zero was the first Star Fox game I reviewed on my channel. Having said that, this is the only one that I would outright classify as a bad title. Don't get me wrong, there are several aspects that are actually quite excellent. The polish and absence of bugs and other adverse experiences, the cohesive art style, and the admirable attempts to make a fun game that are all ultimately for nothing because of a gimmicky control scheme that is so atrocious the only potential way you would be able to derive enjoyment out of this would be if you had two independently operating eyes similar to that of a chameleon. I, for one, don't appreciate the government's efforts to indoctrinate me as a lizard person. I don't need Nintendo doing it as well. I also don't appreciate the retcon of at least 3 previous Star Fox titles that does nothing to address the cliffhangers left from Star Fox Command. Now, one could make an argument of my criticisms by saying that I'm simply a spited fanboy angered by Nintendo's ham-fisted attempts to innovate and ultimately souring the last new entry in a franchise that had been wanting a new installment for several years. One could also mount a blade on a mechanical system aided by gravity in order to serve as an execution method for condemned criminals. I don't really know where I'm going with this metaphor, but the point is if you'd make that argument, then you're probably missing your head. 99999! Star Fox for the Super Nintendo. Moving on from the outright bad, we go to ones that have simply aged poorly, of which there are several. The progenitor of the series, a technological achievement of its time, and an interesting footnote in the progression of graphical systems in video games, the original Star Fox has not fared well with the passage of time. While still playable, its archaic graphics and low frame rate pretty quickly torpedo any desire anyone would have to go back and play this title. An interesting proof of concept on hardware it had no right running on, the Super Nintendo cartridges that housed it also contained the Super FX chip, a processor that actually increased the capability of the system. Imagine that in modern times. Like a disc that genuinely improves the potential of something like a PS5. It serves as a reference point to show off how far we've come, and as a jumping off point for wild hardware fantasies. Probably not something we'll see anytime in the near future, but an interesting concept nonetheless. Number 8? Star Fox 2. At one point thought forever lost to time, Star Fox 2 was initially cancelled after development was going to put its release too close to the launch of the Nintendo 64 to be of any comfort to Nintendo. According to devs who worked on it, it was 99% complete, but was ultimately shelved. A few years later, the ROM was leaked online and the internet community collectively finished it to the point where it was playable if one wanted to find it. Heck, you could even find custom cartridges made in order to fill the gap, one of which I acquired long before the authentic publication. To that note, Nintendo pulled it back out and gave it an official release on the Super Nintendo Classic Mini Console. Having played it, I can say it is a little bit better than the original Star Fox, with a little bit more variance, slightly smoother gameplay, and some strategic elements that make it fun enough to be worth trying at least once. It even arguably serves as an inspiration point for the map navigation elements from Star Fox Command. It's still aged very poorly, sharing many of the issues of its predecessor, but it still adds just enough to eke out a slightly higher spot on the list, even if it also served to inspire the Chicken Walker segments from Star Fox Zero. And now I'm getting angry again. Number 7. Star Fox Adventures. Now, I'm not one of those stickler fanboys that demands that every single title be exactly the same. I don't mind a little variance. In fact, I was actually a little bit excited a few years ago when rumors started to circulate that the next Star Fox entry would be a racing game. So a Legend of Zelda-style adventure game with some established characters from the Lilat system does not outright turn me off. In fact, if Nintendo is dead set on their bloody-minded endeavor to reset the Star Fox series from zero, I wouldn't be opposed to seeing an Adventures remake using the Breath of the Wild engine or something similar, but to adhere to the rules I set, it does feature ship combat segments, of which the final boss also takes place. Going back and trying to play it these days, I describe the graphics as fine, and the combat as fine, and I still genuinely appreciate the attempts to start a cohesive timeline and story between the games to follow, but where it slips up the most is in the cinematic presentations and some controls. In tighter focus, the dialogue, animation, and timing in the cutscenes is so awkward and stilted that it's impossible for me to watch anymore without some part of me cringing, especially when they include the language of the dinosaur planet.
Kill Cloud and a kekt moyorik oi. Kill Ola General.
Moak. Aumdekulak.
It offers an interestingly stark contrast with games that provided cutscenes as a means of reward to signify progression. StarFox Adventures instead makes me dread any incoming cutscenes with the thought of, oh god, how awkward is this going to be? So with all that in mind, I feel comfortable placing this one at number 7 with an overall sentiment of mediocre to subpar. I've also said before, and I'll say it again, this game's main claim to fame is the introduction of Crystal McFurry Blue Foxy Boobs for the internet to collectively yiff over until the end of time. You know I'm right. Fight me. 6. StarFox Command. With the overwhelming success of the Nintendo DS series, it's not entirely surprising that Nintendo would look to put at least one entry on their little money printer. Being one of the two systems that seem to initiate the policy of having to have some gimmick in order to seek the approval of Daddy Miyamoto, the control scheme is almost entirely relegated to the touchscreen. It works after a little while, and it's definitely not comfortable or natural, but it's still better than StarFox Zero. Some ominous foreshadowing of omens to come, I suppose. With that out of the way, one feature I loved from this game was player choice in the storyline, with 16 different endings depending on what you chose. The writing definitely wasn't on the same level as, say, BioWare or Obsidian, but it definitely gave more of a background on the characters, and if you were willing to put up with the slightly awkward stylus controls, gave you plenty of replayability. As alluded to beforehand, there's also light strategy elements with navigating the battlefield map and managing resources. In the end, though, not necessarily great, but starting to get there.
Number 5.
StarFox Guard. Alright, stick with me here for a second. Because it's inevitably going to become compared and referenced whenever I have to talk about StarFox Guard in this segment, I'm simply going to call StarFox Zero a punch to the face from here on out. So with that in mind, let's get started. In 2016, Nintendo gave everyone a punch to the face. With it, they bundled StarFox Guard. Now, if you were willing to look past experiencing a punch to the face, StarFox Guard was not all that bad. Unlike a punch to the face, the controls actually worked and you could enjoy it. Unlike a punch to the face, it was an innovative take on hardware that showed off potential. Lastly, unlike a punch to the face, it didn't leave you in pain and a sobbing husk of a man wanting to die. These days, if you have a Wii U and are looking to something interesting to try, you can get StarFox Guard without having to get a punch to the face on eBay. Who knows? In the future, maybe Nintendo will be a little bit more willing to experiment with riskier titles and concepts without having to give us things like a punch to the face.
4.
StarFox Assault. For being as unsuccessful as it was, the GameCube was a spoiled little prick. It got 2 StarFox games, while most every other system Nintendo has released has been lucky if it got 1. While the first of the 2 games on the purple lunchbox departed to try some Zelda-style gaming, Assault was a return to form with expansion and moderate experimentation in the form of on-foot third-person shooter missions, in addition to the traditional spaceflight and combat courtesy of the developers at Namco. It may not have been entirely fluid, but I'm appreciative for the effort, and once again, it tried a storyline slightly more complex than Space Furries Go Shoot Robot Monkey. Not terribly innovative, but beautiful and polished, with enhancements in areas that were previously sparse. I also remember sinking a lot of hours into the multiplayer mode. For reference, I used Crystal as my main because she had 2 shields and I'm bad.
3.
Starlink Battle for Atlas.
Gee, that's not a StarFox game.
Shut your ignorant, pedantic, insufferable mouth. Yes, the title does not say Star Fox. Yes, it's available on other systems, but it's a spaceflight game with competent shooting, with an entire Star Fox campaign bundled into the Nintendo version, and the main campaign can be completely played as Star Fox, even if he isn't front and center on most of the cutscenes. While neither campaign is terribly strong, they both serve the purpose, and the most important element, the flight and combat, is excellent. The worst part, the Toys to Life gimmick, can occasionally get in the way if you play poorly or try to jump to the endgame too fast, which is very possible because I did it and it's a sandbox game. But then, of course it's a sandbox game. It was made by Ubisoft. Nevertheless, for a StarFox game, it is actually pretty good. And if you're still going to continue to argue that it is no way considered a StarFox game, then I'll be willing to consider your argument. Simply write it down on a $50 bill and send it to me. No need for a return address. I know you live in a state of denial. Number 2? StarFox 64 3D. If you're an intelligent sort, then you can likely guess what number 1's going to be at this point. So why does the remake come in slightly below the original? I would argue that it's mostly due to the platform itself rather than any problem with the game. StarFox 64 3D, of course being released on the 3DS, suffered slightly from being on a platform that it was difficult for immersion. It included a mode using the gyro sensor for controls, which isn't helpful when you're rotating the item in your hands that you're also needing to look at to play the game. And this isn't to say that this is a problem unique to StarFox 64 3D. I contend that, while not impossible, it can certainly be difficult to get immersed into any game on a handheld. Handhelds being systems that are usually meant to be played when you're out and about, at least need you to be partially aware of your surroundings, thus needing to devote attention elsewhere. Don't get me wrong, the game is still excellent. The updated graphics are nice, the classic tracks and sounds make it feel spectacular, the combat is still tight, and the controls are competent. It would have simply been better, in my opinion, if it was on a console with a controller separate from the device that you're trying to view it on. I don't know about most people, but when getting into an intense dogfight, I start to gyrate, and it becomes difficult to see the game when it's on the screen that has attached to the control device that I start instinctively banking when I try to make a sharp turn. And don't get me started on the destruction that takes place when I do a barrel roll.
1.
StarFox 64. And finally, we come to the best of the series. I contend it's the best in the series because, unlike other games in the Nintendo stable, nobody has yet managed to top the game as an overall package, barring maybe 64 3DS. Almost every single iteration since has had some gimmick or attempt at innovation or expansion that also detracts in some aspect. One step forward and 2 steps back, if you will. Sometimes the second step is very small, but nonetheless the step is always made. The only thing I think one could argue has aged poorly is the graphics, but being that it was pushing for a cohesive style rather than bleeding-edge realism, it comes out relatively unscathed, if fairly polygonal. The short play format can take maybe an hour to beat, makes for quick-hit fun, along with dozens of routes that allow for several hours of replayability. Miyamoto has gone on record to state that he was inspired by Star Wars and wanted to recreate something seemingly just as epic. While being mostly a success to that endeavor, most of the iterations have since fallen away or had something blocking them from that vision. It still sits in my top 10 favorite games of all time, and is responsible for other game habits of mine, such as me still using Y inversion in most of my games to this day. And there you have it, the StarFox games ranked from worst to best, and yes, I include Starfield on there. But if I may take an aside, yeah, it's very discouraging that Nintendo doesn't seem to want to do anything and they're letting the franchise lay fallow, but I'm not really saddened about it because it's such a great game that people are now taking the formula that they laid out and they're doing their own thing with it. They are making new things like Whisker Squadron, and so long as people are taking stuff like that and making new and better stuff from it, I'm not going to be sad about it. And this note is uncharacteristically optimistic to end on for a video of mine. Also, I'm not a fur... Hey, look at that, it's the end of the video. On screen, you should be seeing the winner of last week's Steam Key giveaway. All you have to do to enter is leave a comment and have contact information on your YouTube profile. But more importantly, thanks for watching and keep your head on your shoulders.